Now, I'm just going to introduce Phil Pennington, who is chairing this panel. I don't know if you went to the Govis conference last year, you would have seen we had a panel which was also chaired by Phil, and I think he did a great job of chairing the panel. And I think the great thing about Phil is he's not a public servant. He wasn't polite. He really asked some tough questions. And people really enjoyed that. We got a lot of really positive feedback. So we've invited Phil back again this year to chair another panel, and I'll hand over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Paddy. Ko Phil Pennington aho, awa kairangi aho, he kairi puwata ki te irirangi o Aotearoa. Kia ora. So I'm Phil Pennington. I'm a reporter with RNZ. I live in the Hutt, and my favourite place and my dog's favourite place is Te Awa Kairangi, the Hutt River. Thanks for having me back. Thanks for the kind words, Paddy. Obviously I didn't upset too many people. If I have had any interactions here with anyone on the phone, I apologise now. I hope you'll give me a break. But thanks for having me, and thanks for having us. I just want to introduce the panel. What we're talking about this morning is really about the cloud and cloud first, and sovereignty and security. So those four things, keep them in your mind. We'll introduce the panel. I'll just give a little bit of an intro. Then I'll have some questions for them, curly questions. Then we'll have a bit of time when we can get questions from abroad and also from the floor, and we'll see how we go. So our panellists today are Dr. Taka Keegan, who's a veteran computer scientist at Waikato University, associate professor. He's been surveying Māori data and its interactions, including with the state, for a long, long time, including with discussions with Ngai Pā or open access. So welcome, Dr. Taka. And our other panellist is Joblin. Lou, welcome. She is a senior associate at Duncan, Cotterill. So she's working in the field of privacy and data protection. She does a lot of advice for individuals, but also for agencies. So welcome, Lou. And on the far end, Christie, ex-Zambia. And I think you came, what waka was it that you said you came over on?
Oh, Mawingo, Swahili for little cloud.
Mawingo, Swahili for little cloud, come from Zambia. And Don Christie is the Managing Director at Catalyst IT, and that runs Catalyst Cloud, which is the only locally all-of-government accredited cloud provider alongside some of the big boys in tech. Just by way of introduction, I think there's a dilemma we face, and it's illustrated by a couple of New York Times stories. I don't know if anyone heard these. There was the statement, a one-line statement that was put out just about last week or 2 weeks ago by AI luminaries, like the head of AI, OpenAI, the guy who runs it for Google. And this one line basically said, AI is now an existential threat and should be addressed in the same vein as climate change and nuclear weapons. So that's on the one hand. At the same time, in the New York Times, there was a story about a lawyer somewhere in Nebraska or a senior guy who got all these legal briefs from ChatGPT and chucked them into the court in support of his case, only to find out, of course, that they were completely fictionalised. And when they asked him, what due diligence did you do on these legal briefs, he said he asked whether they were correct, and they said, well, who did you ask? And he said, I asked ChatGPT. What the New York Times podcast, Hard Fork, I don't know if you know it, it's a great thing, Hard Fork. Apparently Hard Fork is where you start, you guys will be familiar with this, you start an IT project, you mess it up completely, and then you have to throw everything away and go down a hard fork. Anyway, it's called Hard Fork, and they said that what this illustrates is you've got a dilemma, which is where the tech is not good enough, and you get a bad result, that's the lawyer, or it's in the long term too good, and you get a bad result, existential threat. You can also see this with, I think, facial recognition. The short-term problem of not good enough is that it's biased and people get locked up who didn't do anything. So then the emphasis is to make it better and better. But then you get a long-term threat, which is you get a China situation, mass, very effective state surveillance. So in solving the short-term threat with the IT, you run a risk of creating a long-term threat. And with the cloud, I'd like to just hold your attention on that tension, because you work in government, you work with a cloud-first policy, and it can be argued that you have a short-term problem, which is masses of data, storage and processing, and what to do with it. And that's your security, I'd argue, or suggest, posit. And then the long-term problem, though, is that as you try to solve that short-term problem with the cloud of security, you introduce a long-term problem of sovereignty, which is what we're talking about today. So without any further ado, I hope that made sense. It made sense to me anyway this morning. But I got up pretty early and I missed my train, and it was very, very cold, and the head wasn't working very well. And then this morning I was reporting actually on the radio on critical national infrastructure. So that's the other thing to bear in mind. Critical national infrastructure and what they're doing in the government now. There's a bill, there's some consultation going on. You all work in this field, and the cloud is critical national infrastructure. And what was interesting in the papers that I was drawing on for the radio is that it says in them, the advice from the officials is that, if I can find the quote, there is no, it says the risks, including national security risks, facing critical infrastructure are increasing at the same time as our regulatory system is being outpaced by technological change. For example, cloud service providers, data service storage providers, and forthcoming technologies to support smart cities and Internet of Things all sit outside New Zealand's existing regulatory frameworks. They are not subject to regulation around their resilience at all. So that's talking about the cloud. Our first question, and I think Lou will start with you. So Lou, in terms of the cloud, and we're talking about the cloud first policy and going to the cloud, could you just unpack for us how much government data is not in the cloud, and is it safer there or is it riskier the fact that it's not in the cloud?
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. So look, in my preparation for this, what I identified is that about a third of government data at the moment is sitting in a cloud, so about 2/3 is not. And I think there are some very real risks with that 2/3 that's sitting outside in on-premise storage or in hard copy, duplicated, who knows, where and by whom and how it's protected. I think that means that, at least thinking about the short-term benefits, and the other two panellists can talk to some of the real concerns, but there are some unrealised, quite material benefits to getting that 2/3 out of wherever it is now and into the cloud, in terms of resilience, in terms of security, in terms of privacy protection where it relates to individual data.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of those risks and sovereignty, does that come into the mix? How does that come into the mix? Because the stuff that is sitting here that's not in the cloud, you've got more control of it or not necessarily?
I don't think necessarily. It would depend entirely where it is and how it is. I think the idea of sovereignty, if you've got many things in many places in many formats, I would consider that's really quite a barrier to sovereignty. Taka can speak to that a lot more, but I would say that is not furthering the idea of sovereignty at all.
Well, what do you other two think? If we're talking about security, remember we're thinking like the short-term problem is data everywhere, and Louisa said that there's a lot of government data. I thought there was a lot more than that in the cloud, but you're saying that 2/3 of it's not in the cloud, which is a lot, right? Is that actually the imperative here? The first thing we should be doing is getting it into the cloud?
I don't think it's an imperative that we get it into the cloud. For me, I think the imperative is that Māori have control of Māori data, whether that's in the cloud or whether that's in their own servers on their own sites. And that's one of the issues at the moment. In terms of Māori data sovereignty, there's no real Māori data sovereignty because Māori don't have control of these data. And it was interesting listening to Michael earlier, because he was identified in terms of security risks, identifying which of your data is Māori. Well, my perspective is, well, that's okay to identify it, but so what? What are you going to do with it? Māori data sovereignty is giving Māori control of their data, whether it's located locally or whether it's located in the cloud. The issue with the cloud is there's avenues and opportunities for other agencies, other countries to have sovereignty, have control, have access to it, where there isn't the same issues if you have in-house stored data, and that's a danger as well.
So do you think that security-wise, that's sort of a lesser thing, and you can deal with that without having to default to the cloud, is basically what you're saying? If the cloud is problematic for sovereignty, don't go there.
It depends where the cloud is. If the cloud is problematic for sovereignty, if the cloud is offshore, definitely, because then you're liable to laws and regulations of other countries. But if the cloud is based in New Zealand, then there's more opportunities for sovereignty. But then as well, who owns that cloud? Who has control of that cloud? You know, ultimately, as Māori, we'd like to see Māori clouds residing in New Zealand that Māori have control of. That's tino rangatira.
Thanks so much. What about you, Don? I mean, what we have a problem is that data's just coming out our ears, and so isn't the government's just struggling to keep it secure, which is what Lou's point is that the first job, isn't it, is to not lose it and get it hacked or whatever, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I say this as somebody that owns a cloud company, amongst other things. You have to define what cloud is. I mean, basically, cloud is a bunch of computers sitting in racks somewhere. And to sort of make out that there's this magic because we've discovered some new terms or language for computers sitting in racks somewhere, using virtualization technologies and technologies that allow us to do micro-billing per second of use of, you know, a CPU or a disk or some networking capability, doesn't automatically make it secure, private, under anyone's control. So I think we've got to forget this idea. And sometimes, you know, the benefits, if I read something like the Cloud First policy of using cloud, are literally just not laid out. There's no dollars and cents in that document. There's no sense of how much the country will save or how much value we'll get from using those technologies, which is unbelievable, really, when we're saying all of New Zealand government data and systems need to move to cloud, and nobody's done any economic analysis of this. It's just stunning. So yes, with the latest technologies, the latest servers, working with the likes of NCSC and GCSB and so on, we can improve our own security, and we should. But let's not make the assumption that just moving to cloud will make things magically better, because we know there are SaaS platforms and other platforms, Salesforce and so on. We have no idea what their security is like.
So actually, I never get to interview 100 or 200 people at once. So Don, you were saying you don't think there's been any economic study to do with, what was it?
No, I've never seen the cost benefits from the New Zealand government. Whenever you ask for that information from, for example, a GCDO behind the policy, they always say they don't know because they don't know how much individual agencies are spending. So and we know that cloud usage, as somebody that sells cloud, is like a telephone bill. Right, you get your invoices for your cloud usage, and there's 1,000 different items. Every text message that is sent is billed separately. So the OPEX of using cloud is massive. In fact, the economic case for building private cloud for government, you'd basically probably save money 10 to 1 if you had a private government cloud.
So there might be someone from GCDO here or DIA. Does anyone aware of a cost-benefit analysis, a study that's been done on it? Anyone at all? Never heard of it.
I think we're working on it. Just texting Tony Isles. He's the director of the cloud program, so he'll be coming to the conference very shortly.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and I met Tony last week and ran this past him, and he had no answer to that.
Tough questions. So Tony's coming, so maybe we can hear from Tony later on about what is happening. So it's fascinating to know that there's not a lot of visibility, and this is one of the things. My job is to get visibility, my job is to ask questions, and often what I'm finding, hitting this again and again, is that either you can't get it, or you're referred on to somebody else, or when you do get it, it's redacted, which is a wonderful thing. I love redactions. To the second question, to Taka, if I were to ask you, what are the key Māori perspectives of the government's previous and ongoing interests in cloud storage by multinational companies. And I guess at a figure here, and Don, you probably know more than me, but I think you're talking about the high 90% in terms of our overall data. If you take is it 33% or so that government data that is in the cloud, and that is migrating there swiftly, I understand it's in the high 90s of that is within cloud providers who are from the US. So the big three, typically AWS, Microsoft and Google. So
the key, I guess the key perspective is that the government is saying, in terms of Māori data, we know what's best, we're going to put it in what we think is safe, and it's kind of against like Article 2 of the treaty. So Article 2 of the treaty, Māori have tino rangatiratanga over Māori taonga. So we consider data our taonga. So the key thing is, well, Māori should have a say where Māori data goes, but it's not even a consideration. Like I said earlier, Michael was talking about, well, we should identify where our Māori data is, but there's still no opportunity for Māori to have authority, sovereignty, tino rangatiratanga over that data. Because for a whole bunch of reasons, Māori don't trust the government to look after its data, but we don't have an opportunity to have a say in it.
what would be one thing that you could need to even get to see it? Like how visible is it? What is held and what is Māori?
I don't know how you could get to see it, but there are examples of repatriation of other taonga. So, we've got repatriation of taonga from museums. Why can't we start a process where we're repatriating data, returning Māori data to Māori control, Māori access? Because the other thing is, what's special, what's unique, what's important to Māori isn't necessarily what's special, unique and important to the government. So Māori can't trust government to see data in the way they see it, so we can't trust them to look after it. So really it's the call. We feel we can look after it. Let's start repatriating the data. And then if there are elements of the data that the government needs, then, ask the different individual iwis that hold that data.
Would that require, to repatriate it, would you actually have to have a Māori-controlled cloud provider to repatriate it to?
Yes.
Is there one?
We're working on it. There will be one in the very near future. It's I don't think it's a very difficult thing to do, and we're quite confident that we can do that. So yeah.
If that cloud provider, once it's set up, if you were to go to, think of going to Stats or something and saying, can we have the Māori data that you have to put into our cloud, and to take it out of where you control it, because is that what you would want? Is that it actually, it's not held and that you get a copy, you actually get the whole thing?
Yeah, that's Māori data sovereignty. Māori having control over their data. It's exactly it.
Do you foresee a problem with that from the government side?
Yeah, because I don't believe the government thinks Māori have the capacity to look after their own data. So I do see a problem. I do see the government having a problem with that.
Well, Lou, if I can bring you in here, so we're talking there, do they have the capacity? So talking security and privacy there. Any thoughts, any comments on that?
I think the cloud first policy is really aspirational, and there's a real difference between government data, the stuff that the government is interested in protecting, and then I guess more from the point of view of the agencies within the government, the humans, the data points behind that. I guess I can see some really straight, kind of in-your-face technical issues with removing some of the data and putting it somewhere else. Because of that separation between data as stuff that's important to the government versus personal information that actually relates to the humans that sit behind it.
So is there a middle ground? I do recall a GCDO, I think it was GCDO report and you might know that this one, Don, that said that, and I think it was a report that they might have had to do again, so maybe it wasn't a great report, but it said that Māori were interested in a partnership. So in other words, Māori wouldn't run the cloud platform, but they'd get Microsoft to do it, but they'd partner up and somehow have some control of it. That's what was being said in this thing. It was about 2 years ago, I remember, 2020 report, something like that. Does that ring any bells? And is that an option?
I can't remember the report. Māori partner with Microsoft. A couple of our major iwi partner with Microsoft at the moment. Personally, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. I feel that everything that Microsoft can provide, well, we can actually build it ourselves, but we can build it from a Māori perspective. And then when Microsoft don't want to do an upgrade or, they want to change it, want to charge us a little bit more, we're not under that control. So my personal perspective is, well, partnering with a large international organisation in theory sounds like an easy way to do things, but in the long run it's detrimental. Let's just build it ourselves.
Don, you've been building this stuff. Can you just comment on whether there's necessarily, I think it's a core question, a trade-off here, that if you want the security for Māori data, or any data, for instance, that you'd necessarily going to trade off if you do it locally or you do it small with sovereignty, because you're going to gain sovereignty but you're going to lose security because the big guys know how to do it better. I mean, I'm only a lay person, but I would have thought the big guys do know how to do it better, because this game is scale, isn't it?
Yeah,
so they've got more data and they've got more tools, they get to play with more stuff.
So you heard from NCSC earlier today. New Zealand's a tiny country. The idea that we're hyperscale is a joke. We're kind of 0.16% of the world's population and 0.34% of its economy. We're not a hyperscale country. So the approach we can take to cybersecurity is national and local and community. We have that opportunity. The technology as well, if I look at the technology behind Catalyst Cloud, it's OpenStack, it's completely open source. It was born hyperscale, if you like. It was born out of NASA and CERN with the Large Hadron Colliders. It's used in the NSA on tens of thousands of hypervisors. But when we brought it to New Zealand, when we were first doing our proof of concepts over 10 years ago, we were running it on laptops, because it can scale right down as well. And so to pick up on the earlier comment about building local capability, research capability in Arohe, in the areas where Mataranga Māori applies, which is very, very local, is absolutely the future of cloud computing. And this is where, something like the Cloud First policy is just completely missing on a vision and opportunity. It's the opportunity to enable Māori and the rest of New Zealand. Data sovereignty isn't solely a domain of Māori. We're damn lucky to have people like Te Taka leading this conversation. It's a concern to all of us. It's a concern to the rest of the world. And so, we shouldn't just park the idea that, oh yes, if we solve it for Māori, we can then forget about it for the rest of us. We all need to worry about this stuff and be concerned about it. So one, the technology is going in a direction that absolutely backs up what we've just heard about what capabilities can be built. And two, New Zealand is in a unique position to create a cybersecurity framework that would protect our manufacturers, protect our communities, and protect our small businesses.
How much longer have we got? Because we want to leave some time for questions from the floor or virtually. 15, oh, that's fine, okay.
Can I just make a quick
absolutely.
comment?
Go for it.
So earlier today there was a question about whether you were able to use AI in your company or not. And the fear about using AI in your company was that it was feeding all your information back to the mothership. Well, why don't we have an AI system that cuts off from the mothership, and then we use that in our company? So last night I was talking with one of the researchers at Waikato University, and he had a version of AI running on a 5-year-old laptop. And it wasn't as fast as ChatGPT, but it was pretty good, and it was responding in exactly the same way. So rather than fear the technology, I think it's better to use the technology for our benefit. And so the example we have at the moment is that ChatGPT works really well for Te Reo Māori. And it's like, well, how does it do that? How does it know? And it works on data. It's managed to get a whole lot of data. And, well, where does it get that data from? Because I know where the largest Māori language corpora are in New Zealand. And I know they're not sharing them with OpenAI. But most of its data, 66% of its data, it gets from trawling the web. So then we're thinking, well, let's run a version of a Māori ChatGPT that's not able to crawl the web, but able to crawl Māori actually data, and specifically iwi data. Let's have an iwi data ChatGPT that isn't feeding stuff back, to the mothership, that doesn't need to be cut off, that we can use it for our benefit. So really, I think it's about understanding the technology, understanding the flaws in the technology, but turning around, using it for our benefit, but also not having to be reliant on some big overseas corporation as our saviour. We can do this.
So just pick up on that, actually. Remember, we were talking about short-term, trying to fix short-term problems, and whether that's delivering us down a long-term road that we don't actually want to go down in terms of sovereignty. I think to reflect back, you're saying actually it's possible, if we had to take you on good faith, that you can build this stuff locally, it can be good enough for security, so we don't have to trade off, and then we just have to grapple with the sovereignty thing. But where we're at, decisions are being made above whatever level they're being made at. Maybe some of you are making these decisions that are privileging certain things. So I know, for instance, there are memorandum of understanding that the government has with Microsoft, and they just signed one with AWS. Is there a memorandum of understanding with any local cloud provider, Don? No. Don't know why. So the government made that choice. We see Microsoft, I'm just looking at an OIA now, in behind at the Ministry of Education, discussing, and this is under the MOU that came out from Microsoft, which, by the way, was not made public at the time. We only found out about it because AWS, thankfully, mentioned that they had one. And then we went asking for the other one, and we got that, and that was, I think it was a couple of years old. And it has things like a project with the Ministry of Education to look at the use of AI in schools, which the Ministry of Education was very fast to say, oh, no, we didn't do that. I was just looking at the OIA on that, and one of the things it talks about is getting data from neurodiverse students and giving it to Microsoft.
Wow, that's stunning.
Haven't reported on that yet. What I'm getting to is that there are decisions being made, there are paths that are being trod, and so what I want to get to, and starting actually with Lou, actually no, we'll start with John because it was your question. We'll come to you, Lou, second. No, just give us the 20. If we stay on this where you think we are, because we all think we're different places, but if we start where you think we are, 25 years hence, where are we going to be at? That was your question, Don.
Right, okay. Let me just unpick all the comments beforehand. So I like to kind of look back to try and inform the future. And you mentioned in the start that I was born and brought up in Zambia. I was born 2 years after that country became independent. And our first president was Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, whose philosophy was as a humanist. That was how he wanted to run and govern the country, and it was a very people-centered philosophy. He would have been inspired by people like Mahatma Gandhi, who spent his early life in South Africa, and would have been dealing with people in the ANC and so on. Mahatma Gandhi was inspired by Te Atiawa, the people of Parihaka. So here we are coming around full circle, where Māori leadership and thinking and philosophy back in 1860 to 1880 led the world in thinking how you unpick an empire. I mean, imagine that. That thinking led the thinking about how to unpick the biggest empire that the world had ever seen. Māori thinking now is leading us on how we think about the future of data, of digital sovereignty, of cloud. And the rest of the world is following. The rest of the world is looking at this thinking. We're looking at Mataranga Māori, knowledge systems, how we want to treat data, what our communities want. And the technology, as I said earlier, is behind that. We're ready to go. we can build the local cloud capability for tens of thousands of dollars, not even hundreds of thousands. We can federate those local clouds so that they come under the governance of the people for whom those clouds have been given and who can serve their communities. But then when it's important to share data, maybe for ecological reasons, for whatever the purpose of the data was gathered for, to share that data so it creates that greater purpose. That's what we can enable, and that's what the world wants, and that's what it's looking back to New Zealand for again. So, as I said earlier, I think we're really lucky to have people like Chris Cormack, the Te Kahuiraranga group, to have Te Taka here and so on as well. We're incredibly lucky, and the rest of the world is watching us.
Big question. Big question. Before we take questions from the floor, I just wanted, Lou, from a legal point of view, do you see problems? Because when you go down a track, you sign contracts, etc., etc. Aren't we just locked in now?
Do you mean with Microsoft and things? It's hard to say, I guess, not knowing the terms of those contracts. But yeah, I think that could be a real concern that we've committed. Who knows for how long and on what terms. I guess I would be hopeful that we have retained the ability to do other things. You know, to my mind, a memorandum of understanding doesn't sound like a be-all and end-all agreement, but I don't know. Really, I don't know enough about the terms.
I suppose the MOU is like turning over the garden and then it's what you sow in it afterwards, but it is getting sown with those seeds that are for that. And the trouble now is that you'd have to be digging another garden somewhere else, and the government, we know there's not the resource. So yeah, what do you think? It's hard to see it changing.
Yeah, I think at a sort of take a step back level in terms of the relevance for the people here, none of that takes away from the agencies the ability to plan and prepare and put good measures in place and have, you know, as Mike was saying before, have a plan so that none of this is a surprise. You know, you still have that.
Again, I do think we need to move to take some questions from the floor, Phil, before we go too far. I've got some from Slido, but we will also take questions from the floor. So if you've got a burning question, you want to hear your own voice rather than my voice reading it out on Slido, put your hand up, and my colleagues over there will give you a microphone. First question on Slido is, I'm not going to read that first question. The answer is no. What are some current examples of Māori having control of Māori data originally held or gathered by the state? Do government agencies understand what this means?
Well, that's kind of the issue. I don't think there are any examples. I don't know any data that's been able to be repatriated because I don't think the government has faith in Māori to be able to look after its data, which is quite disappointing.
I have an example that might be relevant, which is when we publish stats, because I work for Stats NZ, when we published the iwi affiliation data, I think it was last year, we released it on Te Whata at the same time, or possibly even slightly before it was released on the Stats NZ website. That's not exactly the same thing, but I think we're trying.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Any hands up in the audience? No? How can we say we don't know the security of Salesforce and other vendors when they can produce SOC 2 and audit reports every year?
Is this for me?
I don't even know what it means.
Anyone remember SolarWind? Anyone impacted by SolarWind? No? So that was the software that a lot of agencies in New Zealand and across the world use to run their Microsoft frameworks and desktops and so on. That was subject to a very serious hack earlier this year. It was audited and certified up the wazoo. If you read the Cloud First policy, actually one of the things that they talk about with data centres that are based in New Zealand is that you can physically audit them. And for 8 years, we've been physically audited by defence agencies, by DIA, and by our clients. The level of audit that can take place close in the supply chain is really important. And it's another layer. It's not, there's no panacea, there's no perfection. I suppose what frustrates me about Salesforce is I keep hearing of another $500 million going to go on a Salesforce project. There's one just the other day I heard about coming up, and I kind of think, what on earth are we doing? I mean, it's a CRM. How hard can it be to spend 20 million and build something in New Zealand that we can certify and keep our health data and keep our water data and keep all this fantastic data in New Zealand under the control of whoever we want it to be under control of?
Got one more question here. How do we know what data is Māori data? Many organisations don't really understand how to do this.
The Māori Data Sovereignty website actually has a definition, and I don't know the definition off the top of my head, but it is there. But it's along the lines, if it's data from Māori or about Māori, then it's Māori data. So that's quite simple, really. If you're collecting data about a whole bunch of people, and in that organisation some of those people are Māori people, then you're collecting Māori data.
I think we run out of time, and we need to let our next speaker. So Phil, if you want to just sum up.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. Fascinating. I hope that it was enjoyable and also educational. Thanks, Lou. Thanks to Taka. Thanks, Don. And I've really enjoyed it. Just before I go, I just want to give examples of where some things have gone. These are real life examples or proposed examples. The police, so they store evidentiary data that is also processed, not just stored but processed with a US company that stores it in Australia. So that's a company called Axon. So there's data that's evidentiary data as well from family violence cases. It's going to Australia. Don't know, security, sovereignty problems. The courts, of course, are going digital. They've said that they will probably use the cloud, and they haven't ruled out it going to Australia. But even if it stays in New Zealand at one of the new hyperscale centres, that's likely to be owned by our friends here, or Google or Microsoft. Well, not Google, they're not in the data centres here. And final one would be Waka Kotahi. So they're about to bring in the national ticketing system, which will have a lot of data about you as a traveller in it. And that contract is being rolled out by a US contractor with lots of experience in transport and defence. It has contracts in transport and defence and with security agencies in the States. So here we go.
Not quite sure what's going on there.
I don't know, what is going on there?
The captions. Something funny with the captions. Let's go.
I don't know.
No.
So thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil, and thank you to our panellists, Louisa, to Taka and Don. And here's a small gift. Well, it's really the ability for you to donate to a charity of your choice from Govis. Thanks.